All right. Hello, everyone. You're listening to the Blockchain Socials podcast. And for today's interview, I have Maryam Monalisa Gharavi. She is an artist, writer, and theorist based in New York City. And she's conceived of a project called the Oil Research Group, which is a bit of a one-woman collective. But we'll get into that during the interview. But maybe to first start off, Mona Lisa, if you can, maybe just give an introduction to yourself and your art.
Sure. I'm a visual artist and a writer, and in my writing work and lectures in the public, I've also produced theory, and by that I just mean looking at familiar things very closely and in unfamiliar ways. I've also been interested in the limits of knowledge, comparative philology of security, extractive economies, and we can talk about what each of those means. And as you mentioned, I'm currently making art and research at the nexus of oil and data and human extractivism in the 21st century. The basic premise, which you might call Marxian, but I think is, fairly factual, is that capital is dead labor, that like a vampire, it lives only by sucking living labor. And the more it lives, the more it extracts. I think that some people say that capital is ownership over the means of production, and while that's true, the means of production relies on extraction, so that the owner or the landlord or the factory CEO or whatever are victors because workers are living labor, and you need to have a victor to have a vanquished. And a lot of the work that I'm making is considering that premise as its starting point.
We're going to talk about, of course, Oil Research Group, or ORG, which, of course, has to do a bit with Bitcoin and a bit with to do with oil. But before we get to that, I'm really curious to hear your story on what interested you in getting into the Bitcoin space and the cryptocurrency space for your art, because this is different than, like, of course, this is very different from, like, people minting NFTs or something. This is a much more uh, much bigger, more comprehensive, I guess.
For sure. I wish I could say I'm an early Bitcoin adopter going way back to the mid 2000s, but that's not true. And it's probably not going to make a lot of people happy, especially in Bitcoin. But I did come to Bitcoin through NFTs, primarily because friends of mine were minting NFTs way before they had entered the dominant discourse. I'm talking like, 2013. And I wasn't an early adopter of that either. But it wasn't until this year, until 2021, particularly on platforms like Clubhouse and especially prior to the vaccine being available, where a lot of the discussions and discourses and debates were happening online, that I delved much further into NFTs, and then especially Bitcoin, where to the point that Bitcoin is definitely a part of my work in ORG, Oil Research Group. I think I was less interested in NFTs as a bubble or a trend, or even necessarily as an artist, like minting my own, but coming to understand their lineage and what their lineage has to do with the history of art itself. One of those things is the question of authenticity, and I'll put, air quotes around that word, and the value of a work. So, for example, one artist I can think of would be Felix Gonzalez Torres, whose works were often accompanied by a certificate of occupancy, I'm sorry, not occupancy, authenticity, that not only gave descriptions and dimensions for the works, but what kind of obligations the owners had to the work. And this is something that, as the NFT conversations were happening, I kept going back to over and over. The other thing about NFTs that kind of inadvertently led me to Bitcoin was this finger or index pointing at post-capitalism. We might put air quotes around that as well. But this question of value in rarity. So in the alienation of the worker from the work, there's this gulf, a lack, a suture. And if we're being poetic, we might even say there's a loss of love. I remember someone in the NFT community, I wish I could remember who, because I love this quote so much, said something like, money is the friction from the love we have wanted to have together. And this idea, or even ideal, was that this rare commodity could then restore love through its rarity. And prior to our, historical moment, you typically saw that in the hand of the artist as that rarity. But then, what does that look like in the digital age, where you have to either promote scarcity or create like a faux or false scarcity in the work? And also, I should say, I'm trained as a video and film artist, and it's always been difficult to commercialize or sell that kind of work, like moving image and digital work, because the art world is still, even in 2021, is still quite entrenched in its preset ways. I was just at the Armory show this month in New York City, and I think I counted one work that might be called glitch art and exactly one video. And it was a video made in New York City. And I think I spent 8 hours at that fair. And maybe there was more. But just to say that there's still this kind of cleavage between works using, I don't know, like an MP4 or digital creations, and the fine art world. And then getting more close to Bitcoin, this idea of a decentralized monetary system in which you're reaching for something beyond just money, beyond just the monetary, was appealing. I consider myself a mentee and a student of David Graeber, who tragically died a year ago this month. But in his book Debt, David writes about endless money as the cause for endless war. And that idea was, brought forward for me in the Bitcoin community, which sees Bitcoin as a limited asset class that is transferable across space and time. And there was, a lot for me to dig into there too.
Wow, there's a lot of places, a lot of questions popped up while you're talking just now, but I think it's interesting that you sort of saw the NFT stuff happening, and then you went sort of backwards from that. Like you wanted to go from like, okay, but where does this come from? Like it sort of it comes from, I guess, originally, if you want to, the lineage of NFTs coming from, it's of course it's on the Ethereum blockchain, it's not on Bitcoin, but Ethereum, wouldn't exist without Bitcoin. So that was interesting that was the approach you took, as opposed to, I don't know, starting minting your own NFTs as an artist or something.
And the reason I say that people in the Bitcoin community might not love to hear it, it was a gateway.
Yeah.
Especially thinking about the fact that, the Bitcoin community, maybe communities is a better word, with yourself, in it. This idea of all the other coins are sort of altcoins, or they're even,
Right.
quote, shit coins. And so it really made me question whether or not I even wanted to put a work on the Ethereum network, or what would that look like in terms of, like, what if this startup or this like OpenSea or some other platform, what if they tanked? Like, what would happen to the work of art? And I couldn't get a lot of answers to some of those questions, but fortunately, it did lead me to, as you say, go to the root, go to the radical, radical in the sense of the origin, the root of it, which was, Bitcoin, and, read the white paper, basically do my homework, do my research, and involve myself in some of those conversations. And then also on the other end of it, which we can talk about, I was also steeped in oil research since at least 2019. And there's also ways in which oil or energy, oil and gas, and energy also have a way of intersecting with Bitcoin in usual and unusual ways. So everything was pointing toward Bitcoin, and yeah, opening a lot of things for me to think about further.
Mm-hmm. So maybe could you explain, like, I guess, yeah, well, yeah, why don't we just start off with, like, what is the oil research group, and like what are its goals? How does it link oil and Bitcoin? Because I mean, there's of course the obvious of, like, the sort of like the recent moral panic around, like, the energy use of of the Bitcoin network. But I'm curious to hear like how you make that connection.
Yeah, for sure. Maybe I can talk about it in like three ways, kind of like what the ideals of Oil Research Group are, or what I hope
Mm-hmm.
to create, and then maybe some of the false or failed starts, and
Sure.
then onto something more concrete. But I think I was trained as a comparatist, which means just to quote Spivak, Gayatri Spivak, who's defined it as placing heterogeneous elements in a homogeneous ground. So I thought about how to place oil and data, which are diverse things, how to put them in a homogeneous ground or a contiguous line with each other. And we can talk about Clive Humby as well, the originator of the line that data is the new oil. Clive Humby, who is a living person, you can look up his LinkedIn. It's a lot of fun. He is a British mathematician and inventor of the customer loyalty card. So if you ever use your CVS card here in the United States at a pharmacy, that's where that idea comes from. So I was thinking about that, nexus. Um, another thing I'm doing is I'm producing a book called Exhaust. I'm also looking to make a digital artwork in collaboration, and the name might be familiar to blockchain socialist. Sam Levine is my collaborator. I think Sam came up in the conversation you had with Grayson Earl on Bail Block.
Mm-hmm.
And then finally, to produce artworks that explore the life of petroleum and data. So I think something about the name and then maybe some of the false starts. I was just really looking to look at oil, petroleum, gas from the point of view of capitalism and colonialism, where I kept finding people were looking at those things almost entirely from a climate justice perspective. And not to diminish that, I think there's really extremely important ways in which that work is being done. It just wasn't necessarily at the forefront of what I wanted to do. And the first thing I wanted to get my hands on was just research, books, other things where I could, from scratch teach myself about petroleum. And I couldn't get a lot of other people to read it with me. I think this is like fall 2019 where the first commission, which I'll talk about, to create something based on this infrastructure of oil that I was looking at. And I couldn't get anyone to read the stuff with me or form some kind of loose collective or collaborative book club or something. So instead, I thought, well, what if I just do a one-woman thing, a one-person collective that tongue-in-cheek is called Oil Research Group, and also has the benefit of having the acronym ORG, which points to this afterlife or contiguous life of petroleum that is data. The failed part is that, well, there was a couple of false starts. One is that the initial project was going to be debuting at Eshkal Alwan in Lebanon on October 17th of 2019. This was where I was going to like debut this work and talk about oil as much more than a commodity in the current global marketplace, and again talk about it in terms of a colonial and capitalist infrastructure that underwrites everything we take for granted, including, the stock index. But of course, as I flew from New York to Istanbul on October 16th, 2019, overnight, Lebanon had the October 17th revolution, and
Wow.
which intersects also with what's going on right now in terms of the extreme shortage of diesel and fuel. And so I got sent right back to New York. And then I had a residency at Brooklyn Public Library and debuted, I think that fall, the project at Brooklyn Public Library. But then as we headed into the rest of my residency and we were going to have an exhibition in 2020, COVID happened. And it's really amazing how one of the first things that happened during COVID was seeing this complex extractive infrastructure globally and also hyper locally affected, whether that's from work and our working lives to housing to, of course, oil. That was one of um, the major shifts or shakeups in the global landscape was oil companies like freaking out about the COVID pandemic, reducing their profits. And then later, of course, the election of Joe Biden. And I think one of the first things he did was in his board of advisors, they included people from like J.P. Morgan and the data companies, but also a substantial amount of oil and gas companies and CEOs as part of that, or former people who were formerly connected to that world as part of his advising board. And then the final kind of cancellation, you could say, happened this year. I was going to do an hour-and-a-half artist talk on ORG at the Jordanian-based art center called Darat al-Funun on May 11th. And I went to bed on May 10th, and woke up on May 11th, ready to do, the Zoom artist lecture. And the latest crisis in Palestine happened on May 11th. And so out of solidarity, Darat al-Funun, like many other art centers in the region, went on a cultural strike. And so at each step of the way, whenever there's been like a public introduction, it has somehow, some way intersected with a major climate or political disaster.
Wow.
And I guess more specifically or more personally, to sort of like why do this, or why involve myself with oil and extractive economies, I think I talked a little bit about how oil relations in a Marxian sense take us back to the question of material production, but also in my own biography and in my own historical reality, namely being born in Iran in the 80s, and asking the question now of would my family have even emigrated to the United States in the late 80s were it not for the history of Iranian oil and neocolonialism and so on. And also even connecting that to the first oil well that was drilled in the United States in Titusville, Pennsylvania in 1859, where the modern oil industry begins, making Titusville, the richest city in America for about 40 years. I think it's still home to some more mansions than almost any other place. So thinking about this lineage between Tehran, where I was born, and Titusville, and then bringing it to Bitcoin, there's a quote by Bertolt Brecht that I really like: "Petroleum resists the 5-act structure." And Exhaust, the book that I'm writing, has 5 acts. I'm tracing oil, I guess, again, in air quotes, the material and social life of oil along 5 points. Dirt, so where it comes from; debt, that Grabarian, David Graeber-esque set of relations that oil has, the complex web that it has engendered; death and the finitude of fossil fuels, for example, and also not to discount the hundreds of millions of lives that have been lost due to some of the industries around fossil fuels; data, of course. And then lastly, lately I've added the word desire, and thinking along desire, not just for our incessant desire for this form of energy, but also desire in the sense of gendered relations in oil and data. And in terms of Bitcoin mining, one of the things I'm really obsessed by is language and metaphor. And even when you talk about Bitcoin, you can't help but also talk about Bitcoin mining, or even this idea of digital gold or digital oil. Like I'm putting my fingers together right now, like you can almost like feel that slipperiness of the oil, or this movement of energy across both time and space, proof of work, extraction, value, ecological arguments. All of these things around Bitcoin had so much to do with my project that I feel really compelled and excited to include it.
That is crazy. I mean, I was thinking the amount of cancellations, and then now is your big debut, maybe.
I like to think
The
so.
podcast. Great. Yeah, that's really interesting. I think for something like this, with like thinking about the connection of oil and Bitcoin, are there any is there any precedent for this type of project? Is there anything similar like it that you've been taking from or learning from as well? No, you mentioned Graeber. You mentioned some like theorists.
Yeah, for sure. It's actually a really important question to me to think about precedent and lineage. And I tend to be the kind of researcher or a person that looks at what's come before me with some degree of critique, but also humility. I think there have been, particularly on oil itself. I was really wondering what kind of works have been made on or about oil. I came to this exhibition at Jameel Arts Center. I think the first in the Greater Middle East, North Africa region, called Crude. It was curated by Murtaza Vali, who I've enfolded into this project of ORG. I think there's going to be a video in which he appears with other people that I brought together to talk specifically about oil and data on the Sonic Acts website. I think it would be like sonicacts.com shortly. There's also an area of research called the energy humanities. And I've noticed that some of its
Mm.
founding members and scholars tend to be around from Alberta, Canada, which would make sense given the tar sands. And there's been volumes of research about that. My favorite part of that research is about Pixar and the world of cartoons. I think the founder of Pixar said, break open one of my veins, and from one side, cartoons fall out, and from the other side, oil comes out. And you kind of see the socialization of oil and petroleum in like animations for children. Um,
Why would he say oil would come out?
Well, I mean, I think he has like a personal history of like automobiles, of being obsessed with automobiles. And also, his
Okay.
son has nephews who are really obsessed with cars. There's a question asked of like, why do children, particularly boys or people socialized as boys, why is it that they're so obsessed with cars? And one argument that Energy Humanities, I think, has made in this brilliant essay I read, I can't remember who wrote it, is that there is a kind of socialization that happens around fossil fuels, and particularly like the head of Pixar has just always been obsessed by both making animation and cars. And
Mm.
so you could say, pardon the pun, but it's like grease the wheels for the acceptance, the wide acceptance socially that we are just forever and ever dependent on fossil fuels. I'm also, I guess I am interested in the material reality of oil, certainly Bitcoin. It would be tremendously exciting to read more, I guess, philosophy about that. But one thing I'm trying not to do is just to sort of restage the iconography of oil that is familiar to us. So I'm hoping to maybe not necessarily make, I don't know, an installation where there's just a lot of oil in it, like physically oil. I'm trying to like think about what ORG or the work I make within ORG, what that might look like. As far as other precedents, these are a little bit unusual, but there's a short story by the great writer Italo Calvino that I think everyone should read. I think the PDF is online and it's very short. I think it's under 4 pages. It's called The Petrol Pump. And in it, Calvino's character, narrator, it just takes place in one scene in which the narrator, his car runs out of oil, and this is Italy. Things close quite early, so he's basically hurrying to get oil at the gas station. And this story, I used to teach this a lot when I was teaching college, but there's this fascinating way that the story reminded me so much of data, because he's physically interacting with the gas pump. He's like thinking, his character defamiliarizes this extremely familiar experience of picking up the pump, placing it in the car. But then meanwhile, as he's doing these rote actions, he's also thinking about the global connectedness and what has had to happen, how many hands and how much labor have had to sacrifice in order to get this oil to him, through what he calls the subterranean worlds. And I think he even thinks about the sheikhs in Qatar or elsewhere, and all of the laborers that have had to, again, sacrifice something for this oil to get to him. And he even, as he's putting in 1,000 lira to pay for the gas, he's also thinking about this, the friction between oil and money. And it's such an interesting and amazing encapsulation, even in its brevity. And if I could do something, even remotely as powerful as the petrol pump, I would. Um, I guess I want to say two more examples. One is from painting, and again, in teaching surveillance technologies and other kind of media technologies at NYU, I came across this painting by Joseph Wright. His last name is like spelled with a W, Wright. And he created a painting of Richard Arkwright's cotton mills. Richard Arkwright is sort of, to me, the Jeff Bezos of his time. And these cotton mills were often employed children. I think 2/3 of their workers were children in the workforce. But what I love about this painting is it's a night scene, and it's like the factory's lights are illuminating the sky, but the painting is created at night. So it's one of the first times in painting that I've ever seen electricity depicted, without so much like showing you the exploitative factory conditions and so on. But it's really allowed me to think about, well, one, Jonathan Crary's book 24/7, and this idea of sleep as the last refuge from capital, or make money while you sleep, et cetera, et cetera. But it also made me think about Amazon and Amazon's fulfillment centers. Amazon famously calls its workers industrial athletes. And there was a leaked pamphlet this year in which workers were told to monitor their urine color and alter their lifestyle so they don't get injured on the job. But then very publicly, Amazon was showing off these new, I call them porta potties, but they're called Zen booths, and it's a space for their workers to like rest from their, round the clock
Yeah, I
labor.
saw
Because
that.
yeah, I mean their injuries were spectacularly, the rate of injury in a fulfillment center is spectacularly high. And so I think the opening scene in the work that I'm writing, Exhaust, is considering these fulfillment centers in comparison to Joseph Wright's painting of the cotton mills in Britain. And then I guess this is more like a theory space, but one of the theories that has really helped me think about oil and data, as well as Bitcoin a lot, is this concept called frictionlessness. And I first read about it in the work of two Marks, Mark Andreevich and Mark Burden, who write together. And they've written work on what they call the sensor society. So this proliferation of sensors that increase passivity or pacification in our world. So, for example, rather than turning on a button, right? Like the 20th century was about a button that you can turn on and off, to put it crudely. But the 21st century and the digital age, there's this purposeful, always on, ubiquitous, and they would say opportunistic forms of data capture, usually marked by sensors. And what friction has to do with it, I think I was thinking that in NFTs as well, but what's something that's high friction is it's hard to do, and low friction is something that's easy to do. So when you think about watching an episode of a show on Netflix and it says play the next episode, or YouTube's autoplay, if you just have autoplay on, you don't even need to interact. It's such a passive form of interaction that it just automatically, frictionlessly, with very low friction, moves on to the next episode. Or when you're shopping on Amazon.com and it says add this to your shopping order, it's quite easy to just add something that you weren't there to shop for. Or even maybe in the case of like McDonald's, would you like fries with that? It lowers the friction in terms of human behavior. My least favorite form of this is like an Uber driver. As soon as an Uber driver or Lyft driver drops off a passenger, the app automatically offers them a new ride. So before they can even think, do I need a restroom break? Do I need to collect myself? Instead, automatically, this form of labor is produced for them. I think in terms of oil, there's an obvious kind of stickiness. Like we think of frictionlessness as something that's sticky, almost liquid. But these forms of frictionlessness that Andreevich and Burden have defined really help me think critically about the world of data.
Hey everyone, if you're enjoying this episode so far, be sure to subscribe, leave a review, share with a friend, and join the crypto leftist communities on Discord or Reddit, which you can find links to in the show notes. If you're enjoying the interview or find the content I make important, you can pitch into my efforts starting at $3 a month on patreon.com/theblockchainsocialist to help me out and join the newest patrons like Brent, Graham, Joseph, Richard Bartlett, Jeff Emmett, Robert, and Switch. Any amount really helps since making this stuff isn't free in terms of money or time. As a patron, you'll get a shout out on an episode like I just did and access to Patreon exclusive content like Q&A episodes where you can submit and vote on questions you'd like me to answer, and I'll give my thoughts in roughly 20 minutes. In the last Patreon Q&A episode, I take a deeper look into the connections between blockchain, cooperatives, and DAOs, or decentralized autonomous organizations. Of course, I'll still be making free content like this interview to help spread the message that blockchain does not need to be used to further entrench capitalist exploitation if we put our efforts into it. So if that message resonates with you, I hope you'll consider helping out. But that's it from me. Let's get back to the interview. Especially in the Bitcoin world, when you're thinking about friction and frictionlessness, I feel like it's maybe a bit too on the nose. I don't know, but the frictionlessness of like capital to flow wherever you want, but like this is sort of like, yeah, Bitcoin I guess is, yeah, I mean it's this idea of whether we want friction or if we want automation to be there, or frictionlessness is sort of like it's a tough question for me to answer. I mean it's too broad of a question because I feel like it's always like very context specific, of course. You know, I don't want billionaires to have frictionless movement of capital. But I also would like, certain things of my life to be automated as well.
I can give an example of that. I think it's important to talk about, why Bitcoin could benefit me, for example, me myself
Right.
personally as an artist.
Yeah.
Often you're in the position as an artist to invoice an exhibition, a publication house, what have you, in order to be paid. And it's really amazing to me how ineffective, outdated, and dinosaur-like the banking world really is. One of the world's most highly regulated industries is like stuck in the late 19th century practically, with a little bit of, internet added onto it. But I'll give you a worst case example. I think in one instance, when I was looking to get paid by a major museum, it took them, and a lot of my work is interpolated overseas, so things that are exhibited or published. And so I have to go through, wire transfers, for example.
Mm.
It took a year and a half for me to be paid. And I'm not even talking about great deals of money. I think these aren't huge sums, but it took a year and a half to be paid for a work I did. And then the payment ended up getting stuck at the Treasury Department for review. I think it was from Europe. It wasn't even, say from somewhere on a list or something. And it really, coming to Bitcoin as an artist, that was one of the first like primary points of frictionlessness that I want to have, which is that I want that amount, the invoice amount, to be able to, without friction, be moved from one person's Bitcoin wallet to mine. And I'm actually going to be stipulating this from in, probably 2022 work going forward, that I will be open to being paid in Bitcoin, specifically because of this. It's not even because, like, sure, there's an economic incentive maybe to be paid in Bitcoin, but for me, it really is about the lack of convenience or even any sense of regulation and regularity when it comes to being remunerated for work that I've done. So I don't want to paint all frictionlessness as, like you said, the device of billionaires. I think that for those of us who are living in a world that's like not quite in the future and not quite in the past, it can be so clunky that we are looking for a way out.
Yeah, it's sort of, I guess to the specific example that you brought up, it's sort of what, one of the things that I'm frustrated with sometimes is how there's sort of like this assumption that regulation is left wing in some type of way because it's adding friction in some place, and that's sort of like the left wing position is to just be like the guy that's like, hold up, stop, what are we doing right here? But as opposed to, I don't know, like I just think it's just like a very limited view of what left wing is, and of course if you're like, I mean, if you're an anti-capitalist, you shouldn't think that way, but a lot of people sort of like one of just to mention that like one of the biggest things that I've heard from people who are anti cryptocurrency is that, oh well, it's not regulated, we shouldn't, this is a bad thing because it's not regulated. But like, but imagine if you say that. I mean, just because I interviewed someone who was living in Iran. He cannot get paid. Like no money can go to Iran, normal money. It's like he has to be paid in cryptocurrency. Like it's sort of I don't know, very like a non-scientific view, or like a non-Marxist view to like just say like oh well, it's non-regulated, we can't, we like, as if the friction is a good progressive thing for some reason.
Well, the thing that goes with regulation, like regulation is such an umbrella term. We have seatbelts, and that's regulated. But like when you're putting a seatbelt on for the sake of your own safety, you're not going, "Wow, I'm really being controlled by a top-down machinery that hates my individualism." I think one leftist critique, pro Bitcoin, would also be just centralization and monopoly. And the case of Iran is a good example. I mean, the Treasury Department forbids me from, say, I don't know, taking or selling a laptop, or I don't know, doing any point of sale of something above a certain amount in my own, in my own country of birth. And of course, and we can talk about Iran later, but that's absolutely the case globally. But even as someone based in the United States currently, that you can be regulated and still centralized and monopolized. You can also be something like the art world, which is not regulated. I think I read that the modeling world is the least regulated industry, and the art world is only second to that.
Mm.
But you also have centralized power. You have gatekeepers to an absurd degree. We can argue the merits of gatekeeping, pro and con, some other time. But I think there's a lot to be said for, a decentralized platform that can supersede these monopolizations, forms of colonialism, and other regulations that have really they've outlasted their use.
Yeah. um so you mentioned this phrase, data is the new oil, which I mean, in my normal work life, I've heard probably a bazillion times, as if it's some like it just became like it became very cliche very very fast. Just like how much, man, people in corporations use that word and like use it for all sorts of bullshit. But I'm curious to hear what your thoughts are on the link between oil and data, because I mean, yeah, on the surface they seem quite different, but then I guess when it's sort of framed in a type of corporate setting, I feel it's more like oil is the new data. Just sort of for me, it alludes to just like extracting value from data, like how you use oil to not necessarily you extract oil, but you use oil to like create some sort of motion, which is presumably extracting some amount of value further down the line. Um,
Yeah, and in the context that you're talking about, often the analogy between data and oil is also in terms of quote big data and big
yeah.
oil. So where the 20th century was underwritten by quote big oil, then our moment is, if you want to get your foot in the door, or if you want to be highly employable, make sure that you're somehow
Learn data
connected to big
science.
data. Yeah, learn how to code, learn data science, and all of those other things. I think like the uh, central concern for me is like, how can I overturn my own assumptions about these things? I have assumptions about oil. I'm sure we have assumptions about data. Um, I first came to that phrase in James Bridle's work, the British artist and theorist, and he was quoting Clive Humby. And I was really surprised to learn this year that like Humby is basically a data marketer, and really kind of like what you just mentioned, looking to have the most highly lucrative extractive principle in marketing, marketing and harvesting data, basically, and data mining. I guess on a more conceptual framework, what appealed to me about this questioning my assumptions were, okay, we have this assumption about oil that it's finite, whether fossil fuels or diesel or sorry, fossil fuels or gas or coal, that there's a finitude there. And on the other hand, there's an assumption that data is infinite, that as long as there's human beings allowed to alive to create it, that datum or data will just continue, metadata even, like the information about file size that's connected to your JPEG will just be infinitely created. And there's not a problem with that. It's not that I think that I want to fundamentally overthrow that, assumption. It's that the conclusion then is that oil and fossil fuels and gas are precious, and that data is somehow non-precious because infinitude, makes you think, well, there's always going to be more. But that's not true. And we just talked about, the data marketing. If it were true, you wouldn't have, a Mark Zuckerberg in the world. You wouldn't have the so-called big data companies. Google wouldn't be what it is without the idea that your data actually, I guess the premise I'm working on is your data is actually very precious. Footnote, it just occurred to me this morning that the Keanu Reeves stars in the two best films ever made, in my view, about oil and data. And they are, can you think of what they are?
The Matrix?
Definitely The Matrix, and I would say also Speed, which I saw. It was
I
like,
never got to saw that one.
I think I saw Speed in the theater, believe it or not. And it was really, again, going back to like the creator of Pixar and, Cut My Vein and Petroleum and cartoons come out, you can't ever stop driving the bus. Keanu Reeves can't stop driving the bus because it will implode.
Right.
So anyway, that was just like it just occurred to me spontaneously that he's been in those two films that have taught me a lot about this. But I guess further, more assumptions, I guess I want to take apart some of these assumptions and like really even down to like making a chart and analogizing, oil, energy versus data and AI. For example, as we were talking about with Calvino's story, Petrol Pump, the work, quote, the work or labor, human hands tend to disappear in oil at the moment of its consumption. So when you are pumping gas or diesel, you're maybe, not necessarily thinking about the work and the labor and the midstream, upstream, downstream economy of extraction that got that oil to you. There's a kind of there's a triple distance from consumption, labor, and product. And I've been thinking a lot about what that has to do with automation and data. Obviously, automation and data are huge parts of the oil industry. My new favorite point of research is like these critters, these little like bots, like robots that the oil industry uses, that are like automated little robots that test or give data about the oil. So like these, as you said, it's a very annoying and kind of overused cliche, but the more you ask questions about them, the weirder and stranger histories that you unfold. For example, there's this idea that fossil fuels replace the labor of enslaved people. I don't think that David Graeber writes about this, but I know that I've read this in multiple histories of enslavement. And we might think about how automation also promises to do the same thing, to replace the work of workers. But we know that AI is not, in fact, that intelligent. AI actually is quite dumb. It has to be somewhat dumb. It's designed, or it's designer created machines. And if the designer lives in a world of racialized capitalism, or one where the stock index is, gone from being underwritten by oil companies to now being underwritten by tech companies, there are some endemic features of postmodernity, I guess you could say, sorry for that annoying word, in both oil and data. And again, I know I keep mentioning Marxian. I just really think that Marx is a really brilliant, almost poetic writer. But I think the person or thinker that has most been helpful for me in this analogy is actually Engels, who writes about, kind of like the Arkwright cotton mill. He's writing about these factories. He's visiting the steam factory. And he says the worst thing in the world, worse than a despot, worse than, the worst despot in history that you can think of is automation. And that started really like, I started thinking like, what did Engels see that automation was worse than the worst king historically? And when you get into the oil and gas world, when you get into the world of data and data analytics and data marketing, Google and Amazon, et cetera, those questions kind of come into focus. And I'm really also interested to discover further what that might look like when I extend this analogy even further into Bitcoin.
Yeah. Yeah. I found it really interesting. I just watched like the other day the young Karl Marx. I don't know if you've seen that movie. But yeah, I just remember watching the movie and like watching like now like thinking about how Engels had to work at his dad's mill and like basically watch the workers, and then he sort of like did his own ethnographic study of them, and like started writing so much. It's really interesting. I mean I guess the from what I could tell, the movie seemed pretty accurate. Maybe it wasn't completely, but I mean it was pretty interesting nonetheless.
You're actually making me think of Bitcoin here, in that
Yeah.
maybe the promise of Bitcoin, and I say Bitcoin because I've just been socialized not to say cryptocurrency, but if that's something,
Is this what the Bitcoin people are telling you?
definitely, I don't want people coming after me in my DMs and email, but I think the promise of cryptocurrency, especially the profit principle, is that you can, through this like frictionlessness or automation, just by simply purchasing more, coming into more and more cryptocurrency, that we can escape this world of enslavement, either to the man, quote unquote, enslavement to our jobs, and even like liberate ourselves from this nexus. And as I understand it, I think that's the promise. I mean, ultimately, maybe not in the next year, 5 years, 10 years, but as far as the idealization of what it can do as a limited asset class, is that it can somehow liberate us. I'll give you an example. Like when you go to CVS, you have a machine now that greets you, right? You don't necessarily have like cashiers. You have these machines, and the promise is that the machine is going to care for you. And it's not just like the scare is it's going to take people's jobs. But the thing is, CVS isn't not hiring people. In fact, there's a hiring shortage all over the world, particularly in North America. Instead, what it does is, when you go into, like, especially in New York City, when you go to a CVS, the cashiers are the ones caring for the machines. There's more workers than ever, but you as a shopper become like a checkout worker, because you have to kind of check out your own stuff. And then inevitably there's a glitch, something goes wrong, and the cashier has to the CVS worker has to run over and help you. So I think the reason I'm saying automation is dumb is that I don't mean that pejoratively. It literally still requires human care and human productive or even reproductive labor. And I think maybe the promise of a world in which we're liberated from both the world of machines that require human care, as well as the old world, the world of the fossil fuel industry, I think that's what the promise is.
How do you think Bitcoin specifically differs from like data as a general concept in its in this analogy with oil?
That's a really great question.
Bitcoin is sort of like a very specific type of data. I guess it's a very like the problem before Bitcoin with data was that it was infinitely copyable. This was this whole double spending problem, which Bitcoin sort of figured out how to fix to create digital money, and then Bitcoin sort of like found a way to enforce a type of finite nature similar to like gold, or maybe now even similar to like oil. Maybe it makes it closer to oil now that it makes data closer like oil.
I was going to say something similar that occurs to me. So in 2020, I took a course at a major, let's just say a major, a major energy industry offers like courses on oil for people within the industry. And I took it very legitimately, but like for my own artistic purposes, and learned a lot. I learned a ton. that I didn't know about oil and recovery and, again, midstream, upstream, downstream. But I'll make an analogy. So in the oil industry, probability is really, really high. And what I mean by that is you can contract a project to drill for oil or start an oil rig on something like 10% chance that you will yield something profitable. And that seems crazy small. If I told you, hey, invest millions of dollars, multiple millions in this project, and you may have around a 10% chance of yielding something from it, you would tell me that I'm nuts. But, and the way I think it's like the 3 Ps, if I remember it: possibility, probability, and provability. And if you can say that you have 10% chance of recovery, it's like P10, so possible 10, and that's good enough for the project to continue. And I say all that to say that with Bitcoin, I think the promise and idealization, and like my interest in it as well, is that there is a high level of possibility, probability, and provability. But well, first, don't trust, verify, like that idea. So like provability, probability, and possibility, in the sense that there's a finite amount, right? 21 million. And then divide it up into sats or what have you. But to me, it seems like Bitcoin's promise, as an analogy of oil, as an analogy of downstream, upstream, midstream, is that there's a much, much higher promise for people looking to, quote, invest. And you don't invest because you actually have to buy it. I have to use real American currency, US dollars, in order to purchase Bitcoin for myself and put it in a wallet. But the idea is that it's a much, much higher rate, a much higher possible rate of return on my investment than 10%. And it's really amazing that the fossil fuel industry is still so expansive and so large and so unrelenting, given that it really has such a small probability. So that's something that comes to mind, that, in a world in which, a lot of people feel disenfranchised, fleeced, they're working. I think I just read a statistic that we're working more hours than ever after the COVID pandemic than before. And I know for me, that's certainly true. And I have it pretty good. In that kind of world where people are feeling, that sense of non-liberation, specifically to their jobs and to capitalist extractive economies, the promise of Bitcoin, I think, is even more formidable.
Yeah, indeed. I think a lot of cryptocurrencies sort of also have become sort of an emblem of being able to finally quit your job, sort of retire early in a world where it doesn't seem like that's even a possibility for a lot of people. But do you feel any discomfort? I mean, I imagine you might feel a little bit of discomfort, at least being in these type of, like, both. I mean, the Bitcoin community itself can be, one thing, can be quite toxic sometimes, and then also sort of like the oil industry and finance are also quite, known to be not so welcoming places, I guess.
I do. And I think before I say much further, I do want to, also be thankful to all of the Bitcoin miners and CEOs of different startup companies that are, introducing cryptocurrency to the masses. Like I feel gratitude to them for letting me interview them and talk to them extensively for my project. But I do think that it is important to claim my own space within it and find co-conspirators. I've been largely disappointed by what I can call like the lack of political imagination in that community. What I mean is, like, there's a recreation or restaging of certain capitalistic ideals without necessarily a lot of thought. And I know, people might push back against this, but of like, how can we get past the extractive logic of capital? Sometimes I feel a little bit bored by that lack of interrogation and critique. And I've already talked a little bit about, how can Bitcoin make my life easier as an artist
Mm-hmm.
whose, money is held up for almost 2 years in the Treasury Department. So I say that as an adopter. I say that as someone who owns Bitcoin, or Satoshi. But I guess looking a bit further and looking a bit deeper, the questions I would like to see asked and even responded to, is like, how can Bitcoin improve the lives of, or cryptocurrency, just do the substitutions you need to do. How can it improve the lives of people on the victim end of economic policies, not limited to, but including neoliberalism, imperialism, major sanctions, etc. And interestingly, in terms of discomfort, I've been in like oil and gas conversations, particularly on Clubhouse. That was like February, March, and April of this year, in which the Bitcoin and finance communities do really cross over into oil and gas as well. And I think it's partly due to the belief that cryptocurrency mining is having a destructive planetary effect, and that's a debate for another day. But just specifically speaking to this, you know, the shortage of fuel. I think I talked about that a little bit earlier. The shortage of fuel, diesel, medicine, and food is absolutely life-threatening for millions of people, including, I think I was reading an article today about the Lebanese parliament was interrupted by a power cut so severe that it forced the government to beg the Lebanese resistance movement Hezbollah to provide power to the building so that the parliament could continue to discuss what is to be done in the Lebanese current colossal disaster. And then, I think it was like this month that Nature magazine published a report, the credible report, that fossil fuel producers should really leave fossil fuels in the ground, because if we touch the remaining coal and oil and gas reserves even further, that by 2050, we're going to have global temperatures rise to 2.7 degrees Fahrenheit. Just to put that in perspective of what that means, since the late 1800s, there's been 2-degree Fahrenheit rise in temperatures that has made calamities and disasters much worse and more extreme. And I'm not tying that to cryptocurrency mining. I think there's so many other industries, and there's plenty of other people that can talk about this in greater detail and thought with greater thoughtfulness, of how huge global industries are the cause of, are the primary culprits for the reasons why we're taking so much fossil fuels out of the ground, and or breaking them open and from shale reserves. But overall, I would like these conversations in cryptocurrency or Bitcoin communities to include, what would life look like? What can life look like? How can betterment come to the lives of those who are on the victim ends of such disastrous policies, whether they be economic, whether they be war, or climate related?
A lot of the potential of what the technology could do is sort of lost on, it's lost on some of its biggest believers, ironically, sometimes. But you mentioned some really interesting things, like sort of with that thread. I mean, there's the obvious, of course, like you being from Iran and Iran suffering under economic sanctions right now. I'm just curious what your thoughts are on that situation and its own sort of on and off embrace of Bitcoin, and like it as an example of a place where Bitcoin clearly has had some effect on the country.
One of the ways that I came to form Oil Research Group was actually this very question, particular to Iran, and my growing up knowing about, say, the discovery of oil in Iran having shifted our history forever, to the 1953 murder of Prime Minister Mossadegh by Central Intelligence Agency, and then, to Bitcoin, which I can talk about in a minute. But one of the discoveries, so I decided to look at this a little bit more closely, and I discovered that the first Westerner to discover oil in Iran is a British speculator, at the time a millionaire. I can only imagine what he would be now, named William Knox Darcy. And he entered into an agreement with the Shah then to excavate Iranian territory looking for oil. And I think the contract was for 7 years. And so there would be a very small remuneration returned to the then king of Persia. And so I think for the first 6.5 years, this yielded nothing. So it was just a money drain, like probability not 10, probability less than 10%. And finally, Darcy's mercenaries came to find oil underneath the Suleiman Mosque, Masjid al-Suleiman, in 1908. And it was also in 1908 when the Anglo-Persian Oil Company is founded. And of course, that company preceded what is now known as British Petroleum, BP. And I always grew up kind of anecdotally hearing that, 97% of Iran's oil profits went to Britain, something like 1 or 2% went to the United States, and then the Iranian people held about 1% of them. And something similar, I've had some extensive life experience, work experience in Brazil, and Petrobras as a nationalized oil company, while it may not have had the same exact kind of neo-colonial story, is always kind of in the news and quite controversial for its dealings with either foreign governments or like corruption scandals within Brazil. So it's not just Iran, but for me personally, again, kind of like at the beginning, I was saying, I was asking this existential question of, would I even be here in the United States had oil not been discovered, or at least not by a British speculator that, essentially, collaborates with the Shah to enrich himself and his cohort. But one thing that I thought was super fascinating in doing research and talking to Bitcoin miners, thanks to Instagram DMs in Iran, because they're very secretive, but would do like voice memos with me, is that one of the primary places where Bitcoin miners in Iran have set up their mining operations are also the mosque, because mosques are a religious institution that are exempt from paying like electricity bills.
Yeah.
And so, there's pictures, you can Google it. There's like leaked pictures of these Bitcoin mining farms set up in the mosques or masjids all around Iran. And then on any given week, you hear like, Iran has banned Bitcoin mining or whatever the case may be on any given week or month in terms of regulations, like not dissimilar to China, but for other kind of political or economic reasons. I think that, this dependence on, I think oil has been such a, like a promise and a peril in Iranian history. It's Iranians, I find, are very proud that our country in its 3,500 year history has never been directly colonized. And while that's true, I think it's really difficult to overlook the neo-colonization of our central commodity. And arguably maybe the one, when I said promise and peril, I guess the promise of which is that Iran is still has some levels of stability compared to other countries in the region. And I think a history professor of mine once took his finger and put it on the map. And if you put your finger on the United States and move your finger all the way to the right, almost every country where your finger is has somehow been torn apart, touched, or destabilized majorly by American war and colonial intervention. And Iran still, it's very delicate, precarious, but it still, quote, stands. But I found it really interesting that the mosque, and I guess maybe religion is the thing that most Westerners associate with Iran, for largely, I think, unfair reasons, but some fair. The mosque has been underneath the Suleiman Mosque in 1908, and then also, in the mid 2000s, or maybe even later, inside these Bitcoin farms. It's so interesting that the mosque has been like the site where this kind of extraction happens, whether it was like by the British or some lone Bitcoin miner, who puts his cowboy hat on and like goes the distance in Bitcoin mining. But I also really like Marshall McLuhan's famous line, "Every technology necessitates a new war." So it would be very, very hard, I think, to look at the MENA or Middle East, North Africa region and not see, for example, this idea of stability in the region as being a euphemism for the stability in the price of oil and the advancement of geopolitical warfare. Just take a look at Saudi Aramco, which is, I think, partly owned by the government, partly private, partly public company. But this idea that when you have a stable regime or stable country, what does that stability really mean? And during my lifetime, I've never known Iran to be stable in any sense of the word. And maybe the promise of Bitcoin and the government's like somewhat reticent but somewhat promising attitude to cryptocurrency is that since the sanctions have been so in the past 30, 40 years have been so utterly devastating, and they continue, of course, with this new American president, that perhaps there are other points of contact to be made in other markets that are not necessarily based on the US dollar. And I will also say that this is a little bit weird, but my own, quote, petroliteracy doesn't just come from the fact that I was born in Iran. It also comes from a childhood largely, what's the word? Like, what's the binging on American cartoons. And I remember one of the big cartoons of my childhood was Captain Planet and the Planeteers. And a lot of the Captain Planet, I was looking up old Captain Planet episodes at the NYU library, and it's amazing how many of the episodes are marked by oil spills and gas leaks. And as a child, I was like very concerned, about the environment in this very kind of elementary way. But looking at them as an adult, as someone who is a descendant of from the Middle East, it's so interesting how thinly veiled the racism of the show was. Like, all of the coal villains in Captain Planet are dressed in Arab clothing and have these like Semitic noses, and they're pockmarked and they have rat tails. I mean, it was really crazy. Even though like the Planeteers are like famously, like, it was this like Benetton ad of racial diversity, and they're very ingenious and positive. So I think it's always really a good idea to question our own assumptions about these extractive economies, but also the cultural geographies from which they come about.
Thanks so much for sharing your story and for sharing your work with ORG. Maybe just to top it off, if you want to let people know where they can keep up with you and your work.
That's a great question. For reasons I won't get too deeply into, I had a Twitter account for 10 years, and that got deleted by twitter.com in 2018. So I've largely stayed off of the socials. But I have a new website coming, and the acronym is We Can Neither Confirm Nor Deny. So at some point in the next few months, WCNCND.com. I also write at an open text blog called South South, and you can find that on thenewinquiry.com. And for now, at least, my Instagram DMs are open. My Instagram is at We Can Neither Confirm Nor Deny, WCNCND.
That's a great name. Is that where did you get that from?
I got that from what's called the Glomar response. Central Intelligence Agency's famous dictum is they won't confirm or deny that they've been involved with anything. So in the 1970s, I think there was a USSR ship that was downed called the Glomar. And so ever since then, whenever you say can neither confirm nor deny, it's called the Glomar response. So I decided to borrow it. There will be an oil research group website also in the next couple of months.
All right. Yeah, cool. Well, thanks a lot, and yeah, good luck with your project, and we'll stay in touch.